We begin here. Justice Minister Ronald Lamola has described as shocking a decision by the United Arab Emirates authorities to deny South Africa's extradition request for Rajesh and Atul Gupta. He says his department intends to appeal the decision. The brothers were understood to have been in custody in a Dubai prison following last year's high-profile arrest. However, reports have emerged that the brothers were spotted in Switzerland late last month. Speaking during a media briefing, Lamola says the UAE concluded the extradition hearing in February.
The court found that on the charge of money laundering, the crime in question is alleged to have been committed in the United Arab Emirates and in South Africa. In terms of the federal laws of the United Arab Emirates, an extradition can be denied because the United Arab Emirates has the jurisdiction to prosecute the crime. On the charge of fraud, the court found that the arrest warrant relating to this charge was cancelled. The reasons provided for denying our request are of a technical nature and fly in the face of assurances given by the United Arab Emirates authorities that our request meets their requirements. As stated, several meetings were held with our central authority and the relevant officials in the NPA to check compliance of our request. This approach is inconsistent with Article 17 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, to which both nations are signatories. Article 17 places a clear requirement on the state parties to obtain clarity on specific matters before refusing an extradition request. It reads, and I quote, "Before refusing an extradition, the requested state party shall, where appropriate, consult with the requesting state party to provide it with an ample opportunity to present its opinions and to provide information relevant to its allegation." We believe this should have been the approach if there was any outstanding information. There was no reason to dismiss our request on the basis of a technicality for which information could have been provided. And I believe the central authority and the NDPP could further explain the issue related to the arrest warrant. We still intend to engage with our counterparts in the UAE as requested in March to ensure that the decision of the court is promptly appealed, as well as devise other mechanisms to deal with the matter. But also, that discussion must also enhance the level of cooperation between the two nations to preserve the integrity of our bilateral relations. Because this request is based on an extradition treaty, an agreement between the two countries, which we believe must be honored.
Meanwhile, the Justice Department says the Gupta brothers are believed to now be citizens of the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu. Gupta family members and associates are accused of fraudulent activities and state capture corruption.
The first one is being obviously the appeal, that once we get the full details of the judgment, which we currently don't have other than the not verbal, we'll then be exploring, as Minister has mentioned, the appeal processes. Recently, I think in the past 24 months, we know of cases where the court dismissed requests for, applications for extradition, and on appeal in the UAE itself, the appeal court took a different decision. So we'll explore that aspect. That's the first one. But also just one point that I think we didn't mention was in the communication that we got, the judgment makes reference to the Guptas being the citizens of a country called Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands, which I think was a new development for us, because previously when their status was they were carrying South African citizenship. So I think that's a critical development as well that we've just noted, that the UAE court recorded them as being the citizens of Vanuatu.
Political parties are beginning to react to the news that the Guptas will not be held to account in South Africa. The Congress of the People says President Ramaphosa and the government are losing the battle against corruption and state capture. The party's spokesperson, Dennis Bloom, says COPE doesn't hold out much hope that those responsible for collapsing the economy will ever see the inside of a prison cell. Inkatha Freedom Party leader Velengosini Hlabisa has echoed the sentiment, saying the South African government continues to fail in bringing criminals to justice.
The government of South Africa has failed many times. The issue of Bushiri, the issue of Senzo Meyiwa case is not giving any hope. The issue of AKA, even now, we are not having something tangible that tells us what is the progress in such a brutal killing. The issue of Dr. Nandi, where a corpse was taken to prison and was burnt there, it's a disgrace to have a government that is failing in every angle. Can it be law? Can it be service delivery issues? Can it be dealing with unemployment? Really, we are so unfortunate. That is why we are a country in despair. But the people of South Africa must not lose hope. They have an opportunity in 2024 during provincial and national election to use the power in their hand, the right to vote, to take out a government that has failed them and vote a government that will take their needs into consideration.
All right, now let's discuss this further. We're now joined via Zoom by Head of Investigations at Open Secrets, Michael Merchant. Michael, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I mean, firstly, your reaction to these developments. I mean, the Gupta brothers are on the Interpol red list, as we understand it. What does this then mean? What does this all mean? Does it mean they can then be arrested anywhere else in the world?
Good afternoon, Onati, and thank you very much for having me. I think that the initial reaction, to be frank, unfortunately, is slightly less shock than the Minister of Justice certainly has expressed. And the reason for that is that society and the public, for very long periods, have been deeply concerned around the silence, around the progress, around the extradition, and the status of where the Guptas were, and if, in fact, they were still being detained in the UAE. I think that what happens now, regarding your question as to their arrest, is that we're left with a great degree of uncertainty. And part of that uncertainty arises because of the timing of this announcement. So as you might have mentioned, we've had reports, for example, of the Guptas traveling to Switzerland before the news broke in South Africa about their extradition being unsuccessful in February of this year. And so we really have very little knowledge of how much they've been traveling over the last few months and what they've been using that travel to achieve. We heard the DG, for example, speaking earlier on this segment about their apparent citizenship of Vanuatu. And we've also heard through various media houses of them trying to seek exile and safe haven in other countries in Africa, such as the Central African Republic. And what this does, I think this great uncertainty here, is it creates space for the Guptas once again to avoid accountability by going through these kinds of steps.
Now, the department says it will appeal, as you've also rightfully mentioned, the decision, by the UAE. Should the appeal be denied once again, what other legal options does the department have?
Well, I think that in an instance like this, if that appeal is unsuccessful, then the state has fairly limited legal options. It could do a couple of different things. It could take a diplomatic approach, which arguably it should have been doing much more vociferously than it has done to date. And so, for example, it does seem to be concerning if the state's account is accurate, that the UAE have been stringing them along for long periods of time. It's unclear why the state hasn't been much more proactive at pushing for news and pushing to be present in the room when decisions have been made. It quite frankly beggars belief that the hearing was held several months ago and the South Africans claim to have absolutely no knowledge of it, despite saying that they've been making every effort to find out what was happening. And so there would be diplomatic channels. And of course, one could undertake various other international legal mechanisms, but very few of those would be enforceable. And I think the reality, as with most instances of international law, is that if the UAE courts decide to refuse this process, there are limited avenues for the South African state to pursue. What I think is important to remember, and this is where South Africa as a state and more broadly, I think the public and civil society need to put on pressure, is that it's no mistake that the Gupta family and the Gupta brothers found themselves in the UAE. They traveled there and they stashed a lot of the proceeds of state capture there because the UAE is a notorious bolt hole for criminals and money launderers. This is the reason why it, along with South Africa, is on the FATF grey list. And I think that if the UAE state is conducting itself in the way that South Africa is suggesting, which seems to imply an evasion of their international legal responsibilities around the extradition, there needs to be great international pressure brought to bear on them to realize their obligations and to make very clear to them that there will be the scrutiny of their conduct in this case, given that they are trying to persuade the world that they have an interest in addressing issues of money laundering and economic crime through their backyard.
You know, just on that point, there's two things that I want to discuss. Just the relationship between South Africa and the UAE. But also, I just want to touch on that last point. I mean, you've heard the reaction from some political parties in terms of their confidence in the South African government, saying that, you know, the government of this country led by Cyril Ramaphosa is losing the battle against corruption and state capture. And then one obviously has to remember just some of the high profile cases, as the IFP president has also pointed out, you know, that this country has really been criticized for its lack of solving high profile crimes in this country, particularly, you know, if you had to mention some of those Bushiris of late, Thabo Bester's daring prison break. You know, what then can we make of these utterances and these, you know, criticism leveled at government in as far as can they really handle such high-profile crimes in this country? And if not, where is the issue? Where is the lack of urgency?
I think, Unathi, that in that instance, it's quite helpful to separate out the discussion into kind of two different lanes. I think the one is the question of law enforcement capacity, and it remains an issue of grave concern, I think, to many South Africans, that the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks remain very constrained. They appear to lack the resources and very often seem to lack some of the expertise and organization to be able to take on complicated cases of economic crime and to successfully prosecute them. And so we should also remember that as this matter drags on, the other complicating factor in the case of the Gupta extradition is that South Africa is seeking their extradition to prosecute them in relation to the happenings around New Lane. And for those who have been paying attention to state capture accountability will know that the prosecuting authority's New Lane prosecution in Bloemfontein has fallen apart in quite dramatic fashion, and it has increasingly looked like most of the accused in that case will be discharged without having to present their case. And so already we saw that some of the shortcomings of the state from the prosecution side might have had an impact on our ability to successfully extradite and prosecute the Guptas. And so just on that front, it remains, I think, a significant concern of those institutions' kind of ability to rebuild and regrow. And obviously, we want those institutions to be acting independent of government interference. And so then that takes us, I suppose, to the other side of the coin, which is the role of South Africa's diplomatic corps and other arms of the state in managing the process along with the UAE. Because, of course, in addition to the warrants and the technical work that the prosecuting authority had to do, we were relying on the Minister of Justice and, of course, the diplomatic corps to monitor the process. And once again, that seems to have failed quite spectacularly here. Of course, their account is that they appear to have been either deliberately misled or kept in the dark by the UAE. But what is so difficult for South Africans, I think, is that the trust in our government's ability to deal with these matters, as you've just said, is so low that when we see a story like this, it's honestly very difficult for us to take at face value what our state is saying to us. And so while we are very skeptical, I think, about the UAE and its conduct in this matter, there remains an understandable mistrust at how open our government has been and whether they are not in turn partly responsible for this failure, and also the massive unexplained gap between the actual decision to let the Guptas go in February of this year, apparently, and the South African public hearing about it, again on Easter Friday, when many people will not be hearing about this story.
And I'm sure you will be monitoring those appeal processes very closely, and we will definitely get more information a little bit later on. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time this afternoon. Of course, your analysis, really do appreciate it. Michael, a merchant there from Open Secrets. He's the head of investigations. All right, we take a quick break. We'll be back straight after this. Don't go away.